Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the European Parliament Intergroup on Climate Change, Biodiversity and Sustainable Development, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's event on advancing progress towards the European Green Deal, specifically addressing OECMs implementation in the fisheries sector. Before we kick off today's discussion, I would like to take the opportunity to thank hosting MEP Mr. Pierre Karleskind, Chair of the European Parliament Committee on Fisheries, for hosting today's event under the umbrella of the European Parliament Intergroup. On behalf of the Secretariat of the latter, I would like to let you know that this webinar will be moderated by Mr. Ernesto Penas Lado, member of the Fisheries Expert Group of the IUCN Commission of Ecosystem Management. Mr. Penas Lado is a marine biologist by training and worked on marine research for 10 years, following which he became an official of the European Commission, where he worked for 30 years on the development of the EU Common Fisheries Policy, retiring as director in 2018. As for the discussion to follow, we're very interested in hearing from our audience as well. So I would like to invite the participants to send us your questions during the event. For that, you can use the Q&As box of the platform, choosing the all panelists option. And within your question, please make sure to also note the speaker to whom your question is best addressed, so that on behalf of the Secretariat of the Intergroup, we can facilitate a fruitful discussion to follow. Once again, thank you very much for joining us today. Normally, this is the moment I would provide the floor to Mr. Karleskind, but due to a last-minute development, hosting MEP and chair of PESH committee has received some speaking time at the ongoing plenary in Strasbourg. So although he kindly apologized for the inconvenience, he will be joining us very soon as we progress. So on this note, I would like to give a fresh twist in the plot of the agenda. So I'll just provide the floor to Mr. Ernesto Penas Lado for guiding us through the event as we progress. So Ernesto, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elias. And let's just start by indicating a couple of small changes in the program. As compared to the program and the list of speakers that you have seen for some time now, there's a change. The expert from FAO to talk about OECMs in FAO and future plans, Dr. Amber Hines-Cornell. She's not available, but she's been replaced by another FAO expert. She is Aymen Melian, and she will be delivering that speech as an expert from FAO. And as for the introduction by the head of the Fisheries Committee of the European Parliament, as Elias indicated, as soon as he's available from other engagements in the Parliament, we will slip his initial intervention between two of the different interventions. So we'll get started waiting for Mr. Karleskind to come in, and as soon as he's available, then we will introduce his introductory speech as he becomes available. So I think that we believe it is better to start with no delay. And our first speaker this afternoon is Mr. Joe Appiott. Mr. Joe Appiott is the coordinator for marine, coastal and island biodiversity at the Secretariat of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. Before that, he worked as a policy researcher for the Global Oceans Forum and for Gerard G. Manigault Center for Marine Policy. Joe, you have 10 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Ernesto, and thank you also to the EP Intergroup and to the EBCD for inviting me to speak at this very important event. I think this is my first time addressing this group, so it's certainly my great pleasure and honor to be able to contribute to this conversation. So I'm going to give an introduction and a background to OECMs, or other effective area-based conservation measures. My name is Joe Appiott. I coordinate the work on marine, coastal, and island biodiversity at the CBD Secretariat. And for those who aren't so familiar with the Convention on Biological Diversity, or the CBD, it's important, I think, to remind everybody that the CBD has indeed three main goals: the conservation of biodiversity, the sustainable use of biodiversity, and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits from the use of genetic resources. Too often we see there's a sort of a misunderstanding that we only focus on the first goal of conservation, but in fact those other two are very, very important parts of our work, and especially the linkage between conservation and sustainable use being an important part of our discussion today. But as a starting point for OECMs, we have to look at the Aichi biodiversity targets. The Aichi targets were a set of time-bound targets that were adopted by the CBD Conference of the Parties, that's all 196 parties to the convention, in 2010 with a 10-year time frame. These address different aspects of conservation, sustainable use of biodiversity and the services they provide, and mitigating pressures on biodiversity. And in particular, the concept of OECMs emerges from Aichi Target 11, which is focused on area-based conservation. So this is the wording of Target 11, broken down thematically so we can see the different elements of it. Now, Target 11 has gained, and it was a very prominent target, and this is most likely due to its sort of headline quantitative goal of protecting and conserving 10% of marine and coastal areas. Now, largely the focus for most of the period of that 10-year period was focused on protected areas. But in fact, the target itself calls for the conservation of these areas through protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures, or OECMs. Now, we know, of course, that protected areas are a powerful tool for area-based conservation, but they're not the only tool, as Aichi Target 11 clearly says. Other types of area-based tools, such as spatial sectoral regulation, privately managed areas, local and indigenous managed areas, can also have important biodiversity benefits, and in many cases can overcome some of the weaknesses in protected areas, and in fact complement protected areas to achieve conservation goals. So we, and I think many others, see OECMs as a major opportunity to first recognize and account for the biodiversity benefits that area-based measures that are not protected areas provide, and also an incentive to shift practices, either from individual sectors or from locally managed areas, to shift these practices that might not be currently sustainable to those that can yield long-term conservation benefits. Now, up until COP14 in 2018, we actually didn't have a definition of OECMs. We were sort of, the parties were wrestling with different understandings of what OECMs meant, but we didn't have a coherent definition or agreed upon definition of what it was until COP14, in which the COP took a major step first to adopt the definition of OECMs, which you see in the top left there, which is an area other than a geographical area other than a protected area, which is governed and managed in ways that achieve positive and sustained long-term outcomes for the in situ conservation of biodiversity, with associated ecosystem functions and services, and where applicable, cultural, spiritual, socioeconomic, and other locally relevant values. Now, it's a very long definition, but I think often as we see these long definitions in the context of multilateral negotiations, often reflect a lot of attention and a lot of different values and priorities that different stakeholders have for this issue, which we certainly see in the case of OECMs. Now, what's perhaps more useful to look at is the criteria for the identification of OECMs, which the COP adopted in the same decision. Now, these I'm not going to go through in great detail, but I'm just going to do an overview. First, that the area, and these are basically features and characteristics that an area-based measure would need to have to qualify as an OECM. The first is that it's not currently recognized or reported as a protected area. It's geographically defined. Obviously, it's area-based. It has legitimate governance authorities. And basically saying that the governance of that area is by a legitimate authority and is appropriate for achieving the in situ conservation of the area. And this can be at multiple scales of governance and authority, including indigenous peoples and local communities. That it's managed in ways to achieve positive and sustained outcomes for the conservation of biodiversity, that the actual measures that are being applied can yield these outcomes that are intended from a biodiversity perspective. And next, that it in fact achieves sustained and effective conservation to in situ contribution to in situ conservation of biodiversity. That it's effective, the area achieves or is expected to achieve positive and sustained outcomes, and reasonable threats are addressed. That it's sustained over the long term, meaning that the measures are in place or are in place for the long term or are likely to be, that it contributes to the in situ conservation of biodiversity, and that that basically, to the extent possible, that the known biodiversity attributes of the area managed are understood and known, and that monitoring is being done to see how these features are being affected, hopefully positively, by the area in question. And then finally, looking at associated ecosystem functions and services and cultural, spiritual, socioeconomic, and other locally relevant values, basically saying that the positive benefits for one or a number of biodiversity attributes don't negatively impact the other ecosystem functions and other values that are ascribed to these areas. So all of these different characteristics can be manifested in different ways in different areas, but going through the exercise to see whether either existing areas meet the criteria or whether the development of new areas would meet these criteria is a necessary step to see whether they meet this definition of OECMs. Now, moving to the future, I think, and the question that many have at this point in my talk when I talk about these issues is, why are we still talking about OECMs if the IG targets are done? Well, the OECM definition and criteria was adopted very recently, and it was a big step in development in the CBD. So understandably, parties want to take this forward. And in fact, right now, our parties are negotiating a new set of global goals and targets for biodiversity. This is still under negotiation and will be submitted for adoption to the 15th Conference of the Parties in April and May next year. And we see in draft target 3 that OECMs, other effective area-based conservation measures, and we certainly hope and we certainly expect that that will stay in that target in the final framework, but of course we can never guarantee. So we see there a reflection of the importance that parties place on this issue as a key method to achieve the new global goals for area-based conservation. So to wrap up, OECMs really provide a valuable opportunity to better understand and recognize the biodiversity outcomes of a diverse types of area-based management tools. They provide an opportunity to shift sectoral practices that might not be sustainable to those that can be sustainable and yield long-term benefits. It's also a very useful way to attract support, technical support, financial support, to enhance management and to support improved biodiversity monitoring in those areas. And in fact, as I just said, a very powerful tool to achieve new global biodiversity goals under the new post-2020 framework. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joe. That has been extremely interesting and very enlightening indeed. Mr. Karleskind is about to be ready, but not exactly yet. So we will move to the second presentation, and that is that from Serge Garcia. My friend Serge, he is the co-founder and the chair of the Fisheries Expert Group of IUCN CEM FEG of the IUCN Commission for Ecosystem Management. He contributed, inter alia, to the conception and development of the Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries and promoted the adoption and implementation of the precautionary and the ecosystem approaches to fisheries. Serge, the floor is yours.
Ernesto, I guess you are hearing me correctly?
And we see your presentation. I see it, and we hear you. Go ahead.
So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am honored to have this opportunity to talk to you about the use of OECMs in marine capture fisheries. As you have heard in Dr. Zapiot's introduction, OECM are a category of area-based management tools that have been referred to in Target 11 and defined by CBD decision in 2018. That decision foresees that OECMs will be mainstreamed in economic sectors, including fisheries, to identify and possibly to increase the contribution of their sectors to biodiversity conservation. OECMs are now included in Target 3 of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which foresees a 30% coverage of oceans by MPAs and OECMs by 2030. You've also just heard what the definition of an OECM is. I hope you have listed it. It's there. I will not repeat it, and I don't think it's necessary. The key properties of the OECM and the definition have been developed and clarified in the decision itself through guiding principles, criteria that you have just seen, and also a lot of good voluntary guidance for implementation. This definition of the OECMs and the criteria that are given in the CBD decision indicate the properties which are required for fishery closures to be considered as OECMs. They should not have been designated as MPAs, and they should be easily localized on a map, which in fisheries is generally the case for fishery closures. They produce, or they are expected to produce, important and long-term outcomes regarding conservation, ecosystem services, and other locally relevant values. Their governance is diverse, it's legitimate, equitable, participative, sustained in the long term. Their management has clear objective, conservation objective. It is to be effective, participative, adaptive, and based on the ecosystem approach to fisheries. It addresses the trade-offs and threats, and it integrates OECMs in the fishery, the sector, and the conservation networks. Its outcomes are monitored, and its performance is transparently assessed. OECMs, like any area-based fishery management measure, might be located in the various oceanographic domains and jurisdictions in which managed fisheries operate. In deep waters, the closures might be vertical, covering the bottom and the entire water column in yellow in the picture. They might also be horizontal, covering only the bottom or the surface and part of the water column, as required to generate the expected biodiversity benefits. It should be noted that different management zones may be created de facto in a vertical OECM by regulating the gears which are allowed to operate in it. For example, trawling may be totally prohibited on the bottom, while mid-water trawls and purse seines might be used in the subsurface. A good question is, why are we considering mainstreaming OECMs in fisheries? I mean, why the trouble? Well, first, to assess and increase and show the benefit of conservation produced by ABFMs, but also to further reduce or mitigate the collateral impact of fisheries, improving the state of target and non-target species and habitats, to incentivize further the consideration of biodiversity outcomes when designing conventional area-based fishery management measures, to improve ecological connectivity in the regional conservation network, to strengthen the ecosystem approach to fisheries, facilitating eco-certification and eco-labeling, to greatly improve the likelihood for states to meet their 30% commitment for conservation coverage target by 2030. And finally, to repair the image of fisheries with the public and consumers. As usual, costs and benefits of OECMs will need to be considered case by case. The implementation may not be that different from that of establishing or revising conventional fishery closures, updating, however, conservation objectives, measures, and expected outcomes. The state may select a comprehensive approach to identification for the whole sector, or they can select an incremental approach, starting with one or a few pilot areas and learning by doing. They could start, for example, by the low-hanging fruits, considering the most conservation-oriented closures. States will also need to ensure that adequate implementation resources are available, that legitimate authorities are identified, and that the governance processes involve all the key stakeholders. They may also wish to review the collaboration frameworks between fisheries and conservation, as well as between sectors for improved synergy and conflict resolution. It would be advisable to revise existing management plans with their objectives, operational means, and monitoring system to make sure that they can integrate OECMs properly. The fishery closures in the coastal area will address the strongest collateral impact and conservation needs. Closures in RFMOs will be fundamental for the conservation in ABNG. A number of issues will be faced during implementation, and they will differ between ecological, sectoral, and national contexts. For example, in determining the priority biodiversity attributes of concern on which to concentrate conservation efforts, in assessing the positive biodiversity outcomes achieved or expected to be achieved in the OECM, complying with the best biodiversity conservation standards that are affordable. State would certainly also consider not only the benefits, but the additional cost of accessing to the OECM status and the distribution of those benefits and costs among stakeholders. The relevant governance, policy, and legal frameworks, such as the Conservation and Fisheries Acts, may need to be updated for a more effective participative process. The need to monitor performance in the long term requires adequate implementation means, both human and financial. In the coastal areas, cross-sectoral impacts on OECM may require improved spatial planning and stronger collaborative processes. In regional fishery bodies, the states may foster the use of OECMs to strengthen the ecosystem approach to fisheries in areas beyond national jurisdiction. This task seems overwhelming, but is very similar to what is already done in well-managed fisheries and may only require some additional efforts. Some of the additional conservation-oriented tasks, for instance, might be shared with the conservation authorities. And it should also be remembered that the implementation is flexible and can be adapted to the local implementation conditions. In conclusion, I would stress again that mainstreaming OECMs in fisheries is a golden opportunity for a win-win collaboration between fisheries and biodiversity conservation at national and regional levels. In many areas, OECMs can be implemented by adding little to existing governance frameworks, processes, and measures for fisheries and conservation. Considering how slowly the Aichi Target 11 has been approached, boosting the identification of OECMs in fisheries may be the only way for many states to meet their 30 by 30 commitment in the ocean at an affordable political, financial, and social cost. The process has indeed already started in few leading states, but it should be rapidly generalized, mobilizing the fishery sector and RFMOs, empowering coastal communities, and strengthening management partnership with developing countries. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Serge, for another extremely interesting presentation. And now it is my pleasure to announce that Mr. Pierre Karleskind is available for his introductory remarks. Mr. Pierre Karleskind is a member of the European Parliament for the Renew Europe Group, and he is currently the chair of the Committee on Fisheries of the European Parliament. Monsieur Karleskind, the floor is yours.
Merci. Thank you very much. I'm so sorry for being late, but we are in a plenary session, and this was the speaking time about the budget of the fishery, the fishing sector, or in the European Union budget. So I had to be make an intervention speech. So the first thing I would like to say is thanks to the intergroup for organizing the event, and to all the speakers for their participation. And I've already heard some of them with really important and interesting input in our debate today. I would like simply to give you a few thought about this question of OECM and the question on how we can answer some of the big issues we have in the ocean. The first thing is that it's been 2 years that President von der Leyen addressed the Parliament with an ambitious plan for Europe, for the future of the EU, a Green Deal for the European Union. But what we said with some colleagues inside the European Parliament, for example, my colleague Catherine Chabot, it is that we should consider the fact that there is no Green Deal without a Green-Blue Deal. This means that this makes sure that we have to make sure that fisheries and aquaculture play an active role in the process, but also benefit from it, and that is what we are talking about. To some extent, we have been heard, but there is still a long path ahead of us for the true recognition of the role of these two sectors. Two main strategies have been presented by the European Commission: the biodiversity strategy and the farm to fork strategy. These two strategies touch upon the subject, but haven't really offered so far what we expected, which means a recognition of the urgent need of an ecosystem-based approach of the common fishery policy. What we can read in this strategy is transsectorial text, and we call for an integration of the ecosystem consideration in the design or regulation concerning this sector. But I think that they missed to achieve something, and this thing is the connection between these sectors. What happens on the earth has an impact of the oceans. We all know that. But what will happen to our ocean will have an impact on our health because we eat some food from the ocean. So we can see that our health depends from the one of the oceans, which depends on the one of the earth. And all these things must be related. This is really important because it will impact the way we share the maritime space and the place we keep for fishing activities. The EU biodiversity strategy set two ambitious targets of 30% of marine protected areas, of which 30% of strictly protected areas, which means that we will need to define these two concepts to see which practices or which activities, and not only fishing activities, will be restricted and to what extent. This definition needs precisely to take into account the multiple factors and sectors that have an impact on the marine ecosystem and the resource. And when I say multiple factors and sectors, it's not only the maritime sectors, but all the sectors, even the one taking place on Earth. This is where the OECM for the fishery sector could be interesting. There are places that have a high level of biodiversity conservation. They are part of the ecosystem approach of fisheries and conservation. They require a case-by-case approach to check their effectiveness individually. And they should be in place for the long term in a dynamic and connected maritime space. To me, we should never forget that the maritime space is a constantly evolving space, and new challenges will arise every day. OECM and MPAs need to maintain a 100% sustainable maritime ecosystem. To help us achieve our global targets set up in the Convention on Biological and Diversity and in the Sustainable Development Goals, and of course to offer a better future for the next generation. So once more, I thank the intergroup for this really interesting webinar. This is an opportunity to understand what OECMs are, how they can be used to improve the sustainability, and moreover, I think that if we do not have a possibility to think the protection of our biodiversity using several different tools, we won't succeed our goals. So I would like to thank you once more, and I'm looking forward for hearing the other speakers.
Thank you very much, Monsieur Karleskind, for the interesting insight provided in your intervention. So now we can move on to the next speaker, and that is Dr. Ellen Kensington. She is the chair of the ICES FEG workshop, and her recent work in delineating deep sea habitat was an essential element to identify vulnerable marine ecosystems in response to international policy. Dr. Kensington, floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much. And I very much appreciate the invitation to have this opportunity to speak to you. And I hope that we can have some good discussion and debate afterwards. So as the slide indicates, my presentation is going to be about a workshop that was held recently as a joint effort between ICES, the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea, and the IUCN Fisheries Expert Group. And what we endeavored to do in our workshop was to evaluate the criteria that Dr. Apiat told you about using 6 case study areas. So we were trying to select areas that would give a range or a diversity of different types of features which might be encountered when states are evaluating whether or not to consider a closed area under a fisheries measure as an OECM. And the 6 case studies that we selected differed in size in terms of the kinds of biodiversity that they contained and the types of measures that were in place, their jurisdictional authority, and the types of expected benefits that you might see emerging from the protections that were put in place. And these measures included both permanent area closures to specific gear types or fisheries for particular stocks, and even one that was a licensed use of an area for aquaculture. So it was a very interesting subject matter, and I give the link here to the full report, which I hope you'll have a chance to look at your leisure in future. The workshop itself was attended by 40 experts with really very relevant experience, including agency officers, government experts, academic experts, ENGOs with experience in science, management, economics, and policy. And indeed, I'm delighted to say that a number of our panelists and even some of the attendees that I recognize their names were part of this experience. So the 6 case studies that we selected were each subjected to evaluation against the CBD criteria that were outlined in decision 14.8. And to do that in a sort of standardized way, we created a pro forma that was very similar to the one used for EPSIS. So for people familiar with that process, we thought it would be good to kind of transfer the criteria that Dr. Apiat showed you in the first presentation into this format. And indeed, in our report, you'll find for each of the case studies, all of the background information and the population of these forms can be found there. So you can find a lot more information than I'll be able to present to you today in the report. But I do want to highlight in the next 3 slides, each of the case studies that we looked at, just because they're so different. And I think it gives you an appreciation for the types of measures and the different issues that might be encountered as you try to consider OECMs for their goodness of fit to the criteria. So the first case study area that we looked at was the northwestern North Sea sand eel fishery closure. The original name of this was the Northeast UK sand eel closure. And this is a really interesting one in that it was put in place to ensure that the sand eel abundance, which is this little fish shown here in the bottom picture, was sufficient to be able to maintain high enough levels in the population to feed the breeding birds along the coast of Scotland here, especially these kittiwakes that are illustrated here. So it was really put in place as a kind of with an ecosystem objective in mind. But an interesting feature of it is that embedded inside of the hatch closure area, you'll see this little purple squares. These are actually OSPAR MPAs that were established through that process. And so you may recall that one of the criteria is that the area cannot already be listed as an MPA. And so here we look at how we can handle that and how you can deal with that by looking at the larger area outside of the MPAs in the OECM. In the second example, we have the NIAF, which is the Regional Fisheries Management Authority responsible for the Northeastern Atlantic. So we're talking about the high seas fishing areas, which are delineated outside of the blue. And this is called the NIAF haddock box. You can see it situated here in the purple rectangle. And this is one has an interesting feature because it was actually established to protect juvenile haddock, as the name implies. But contained within the box are a number of what are called vulnerable marine ecosystems, which are identified through a different UN process for under the Sustainable Fisheries resolutions. And so by preserving an area and precluding all fishing except for longlining, you're actually causing biodiversity conservation for these vulnerable marine ecosystems that are found. And further, this area, as you can see, crosses into international waters and national jurisdictions. So we actually have the EU with respect to Ireland, we have the UK, and then we have the NIAF jurisdictions at play here. So another interesting example. And this contrasts with these two examples from the Northwest Atlantic. The Lophelia Coral Conservation Area is one close to home. I'm actually from Nova Scotia, Canada here. And we chose this area because it's very small. It's only 15 kilometers squared. But at the same time, it's interesting in that it was actually put in place using Fisheries Act measures to stop all bottom contact fishing in the area in order directly to preserve a biodiversity feature, which is our only known Lophelia cold water coral reef in eastern Canada. So it has a very different set of circumstances surrounding it that you may also wish to consider when you're looking at your own individual examples. Going further north, we have the high seas area of NAFO, which is the Regional Fisheries Management Organization involved for the Northwest Atlantic. And there we looked at what are called sponge vulnerable marine ecosystem closures. And this raised some interesting points as well. Here, the one that I'll just mention is that the closures span into the fishing footprint and outside of it. So we have two different types of fishing pressure. We have a set of closures which could perhaps be considered as one if you wanted to submit them together because they share many common features. But it was also in this conversations around this area that concerns over other sectors that could harm an area but were outside of the control of fisheries were raised. And I give the specific example of oil and gas exploration, which cannot be controlled by the fishery measure directly, but could have an impact on some of these areas. Oh, sorry, wrong slide, wrong button. And then the last two examples were also very different. If we look again at the NAFO closures, there are a series of closures that are put in place to protect seamounts. And these also occur in the Northeast Atlantic through the NEAP measures. They're all in areas beyond national jurisdiction, but I just want to highlight them because they represent data poor areas. All of the other areas we looked at have an awful lot of data available for going through the decisions. But for the seamounts, a lot of these were closed because of the likelihood of vulnerable marine ecosystems occurring there. And so the actual data available is quite minimal compared to the others. And then the last area, which was really intriguing, and I think might expand your concept of what we might call an OECM, is an aquaculture site. So this is one that is found off the south coast of England, and it was put in place. It's also small, like the Lophelia. It covers 15 kilometers squares, but there's been very intensive studying of the biodiversity associated with this area. Which in fact has been shown to be enhanced through the restriction of fishing activities by the physical placement of the ropes and by the increased habitat created by the aquaculture lines. So really interesting examples, and you might be very surprised to see that all of these case studies actually demonstrated biodiversity conservation co-benefits. And they met subsets of the criteria and sub-criteria for the OECMs, and none of them were really things that should be discounted, immediately. So I think that this indicates that when we've actually prepared some working examples of some areas close to fisheries measures, that they actually do are consistent with the CBD guidance. And we also found through our application of the measures that there were other areas that needed some clarity. And hopefully those will come forward as we get more information on how to implement the guidance. But one of them is what is meant by this language of long term. So this came up in other cases, both in terms of the permanence of some of these features. For instance, the NAFO sponge closures are reevaluated every 5 years. So is that long term? In another context, we have the sand eel closure where the very longevity of the sand eel is very short. And so we see a lot of fluctuation in the actual biodiversity features associated with the measures. So I'll just leave you with some of these other examples here that we felt needed more clarification, and indicate to you that we also gave our thoughts on these, and you can find them in the report. We have not only considered those issues, but others as well. And these emerged from our discussions, and we thought that it would be important to capture them and have them there for others going forward with this work. So just as a conclusion, I'd really like to emphasize that the workshop, through its case studies, really demonstrated that OECMs can have meaningful biodiversity co-benefits. And these are especially apparent when the measures were put in place to protect species and habitats from destructive fisheries practices. It was an easier pathway to make the case. And I'd like to reiterate Dr. Garcia's point that this is really a golden opportunity for a win-win collaboration between fisheries and biodiversity conservation. And I can see, as he does, that it is a means by which we can have improved awareness of biodiversity features in the fisheries sector and really help to go forward with ecosystem-based management opportunities there. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kensington, for the very interesting presentation, and particularly on the specific interest of the case studies that you have presented that show that this is not just a theoretical exercise, but also a practical one. And your intervention has clearly demonstrated this. Before going to the next presentation, we'll have 40 minutes for questions to the panelists at the end of the presentations, but please feel free to start writing your questions now. Don't wait until the end of the presentations. If you have really an important question, present it already using the question and answer box of your software. Don't use the chat because the chat is reserved for the panelists. Use the question and answers and ask your questions either for one specific panelist or for whoever of them wishes to reply to your question. So don't wait until the end of the presentations. If you want to ask an important question, start writing it down so we can take it first into account when we open the floor for presentations. And having said that, we move to the next presentation, and that is by Mrs. Imen Melian. She is a consultant at FAO working to advance the identification and reporting of fisheries-related OECMs. She is also the Vice Chair of the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas, and she has been leading the World Commission on Protected Areas work on marine OECMs. Ms. Melian, floor is yours.
Thank you, Ernesto, and good afternoon, everyone. And thanks to the organizers for the invitation. As you have mentioned at the start of this, I am actually presenting on behalf of my colleague, Dr. Amber Himes-Cornell, who's the person in charge of area-based fisheries management within FAO. And I'll be talking to you about FAO's current work, but also future plans in supporting and promoting fisheries-related OECMs. Next slide, please. So FAO has a number of goals with regard to OECMs, and following, the CBD decision that called on a number of organizations, including FAO, to support parties to identify and report OECMs, and following the mandate from the Committee on Fisheries that I'll come back to in a little while, the Fisheries Division of FAO continues its work to promote the recognition and inclusion of fisheries-related OECMs and their contribution to the biodiversity goals. In particular, it is interested in providing supports to the FAO member states on identifying, assessing, reporting, and monitoring OECMs, and looking ahead to the post-2020 framework that will have a higher ambition, as we've seen. We have, from the initial experiences, what we've seen as presented through Serge and Alan's presentation, that there are quite a bit of questions when we come to the theory of OECMs and what has been written in the various decisions, but also when we really start the assessment, there are a lot of things that are still unclear. And the work of FAO is designed to be a two-way street to inform the member state, but also learn from the ongoing experiences and share that experiences with others, because that is where the value lies. Next slide, please. FAO, as I said, the 34th Committee on Fishery has provided a mandate, as it noted the relevance of OECMs to achieving a number of SDGs and global biodiversity targets, and has requested FAO to produce and disseminate practical guidelines to support members in their identification and implementation of OECMs. And I would like to highlight practical guidelines. And this is how we went to designing this, in that we'll draft a couple of guidelines, and I'll go into the details of these, but do this really through regional workshop where we learn from the countries, where we test the assessment of OECMs and the criteria and the guidelines through real case studies, and that we really capture the questions and challenges that are faced by countries and attempt to provide advice on how to apply that guidance in a practical way. Next slide, please. So we're currently looking and drafting the guidelines, and we thought it might be helpful to have two parts of the guidelines. First one is to guide the agencies that might be in charge of the assessment on how to prepare for an OECM assessment, and what do you need to know before you actually start the assessment itself. And that contains some of the background information on OECMs and the CBD decision and the basic criteria and so on. The typology of the area-based fisheries management measures that we would like to consider, the initial data that needs to be collected, some initial screening tools to see whether the area could be a potential OECM, so that countries do not lose a lot of time undergoing through a heavy assessment and the area not turn out to be an OECM. And particularly some of the opportunities and challenges that might be faced and how to prepare for these. The second part of the guidelines are supposed to be really a how-to guide, and it's a step-by-step approach on how to undertake the OECM assessment, with suggested expertise to be involved in the assessment. The equivalence of criteria terminology, which is one thing that we have noticed, is that sometimes the fisheries sector and biodiversity sector mean the same thing, but they actually use different terminology for that. And having that equivalence is quite important. But most importantly, there are some questions on how to interpret some of the CBD criteria, actually. So some terms are quite general, and some guidance on that interpretation would be helpful. And the options for how to recognize and report OECM, because the CBD decision has provided some insight as to the criteria, but really very little guidance on the reporting processes. And lastly, but not least, best practices for monitoring OECMs and moving forward. Next slide, please. So these guidelines, as I've mentioned, would be developed and tested through a series of shared learning workshops. And I would like to stress on this shared learning, because we feel that no one has all of the answers, but coming together, we might find them. So these workshops will have the following objectives: supporting countries and fisheries-related bodies at regional and/or national level in the application of the criteria and identification of fisheries-related OECMs, to understand the challenges and opportunities, but most importantly, to synthesize the lessons learned and the recommendations that are really from coming out from the country's experiences, and to solicit what are the needs of the countries, and incorporate that in how the guidance and the guidelines are being shaped. Next slide, please. So we have participated, FAO has participated in the ICES workshop that Dr. Kensington just spoke about. I won't go into the results of that. Next slide, please. And we're also participating in efforts to advance marine OECMs within the Mediterranean region. This is, of course, a region very important to Europe, with various European countries in the Mediterranean. There are actually a joint effort by several organizations that are looking at area-based measures, the new strategy for post-2020 marine protected areas and OECMs under the Barcelona Convention has selected OECMs as one of 5 pillars of that strategy, with very specific objectives. We have had a collaboration with the IUCN Mediterranean Office, the UNEP-MAP program, the General Fisheries Commission for the Mediterranean, and ECOBAMS hosted the first workshop to really initiate the talk and introduce that talk, introduce the concept of OECMs. Obviously, fisheries-related OECMs are really common as one of the highlights and one of the high interest from countries to dive deeper into. And we're currently planning, together with GFCM, 2 workshops, one that would be more of a webinar in beginning of December of this year that help us dig deeper into the fisheries, the various area-based fisheries measures that might qualify an OECM, and an in-person workshop, hopefully in February 2022, to go through the identification process. And a synthesis workshop that will come. I know that this work is also being done for other sectors rather than fisheries, and then how could we have a roadmap towards the implementation of the regional strategies in its OECM component. Next slide, please. The other region that is looking and starting working on OECMs and where we're collaborating with is the Helsinki Convention on the Protection of the Baltic Sea, HELCOM, that has started a process to identify OECMs. We've had collaborated with them on a survey to evaluate some experiences of countries in the regions, and actually Finland has already initiated some work on OECMs. We are planning a first workshop, again, also in February 2022, to involve a range of marine-related sectors, and FAO is supporting the work on the fisheries one in particular, to agree on the characteristics of OECMs in the Baltic regions and list type of potential OECMs existing in the regions, but also to document the HELCOM countries' experience insofar in identifying the OECMs, and particularly through the national processes coming at play. Next slide, please. So some takeaway points from our initial interaction with country, we found that the national process is really important to ensure coherence and coordinating sectors. We recognize that fishery is one sector in the marine environment, and other sectors are also looking at OECMs and asking similar questions as to the interpretation of the criteria, and that having a process with an agency perhaps in charge and coordinating effort is actually proven useful. But most importantly in the marine environment, a regional process, be it under a regional sea convention or a regional fisheries body, is also useful. It could catalyze the identification of OECMs by country and enable sharing of experiences and feedback, which as this initial stage is paramount, we feel. The one common challenge, and this is one point that we will be trying to address through the guidance, is agreeing on thresholds. Some of the language of the CBD is, for example, on biodiversity outcomes or sustained outcomes, and what does that mean? And what's a sufficient biodiversity outcomes that enables you for this area to be recognized as OECMs and not? Is the protection of one single species enough, or do we have to look at other things? Where do you put the threshold and where do you put the bar is going to be really decisive in how do we ensure coherence in the CBD decision and how it is interpreted. The decision in the CBD highlighted that the criteria should be applied in a flexible manner and on a case-by-case basis. But we all recognize that any guidance should help interpret how this flexibility can be applied while maintaining a coherence in how OECMs are being recognized. The intersectoral dialogue is important. I think Ellen highlighted that a little bit in how the fisheries sector could do its work in managing the fishery threats, but also there could be threats coming from other sectors, particularly mining or oil and gas exploration, and how we could enhance the effectiveness of some OECMs through marine spatial planning. And I would point out that there is a particular goal on spatial planning under the post-2020 framework. And then the OECM process is sparking a debate on enhancing effectiveness of marine protected areas as well, because currently OECMs have a higher burden of proof to prove that they are effective, which we currently do not have for MPAs. We believe that there is an interesting debate currently happening that the OECM criteria should also apply to the marine protected areas, particularly when it should be proving how they prove that they are effective. Next slide, please. So ultimately, I believe some of the conversation happening in the fisheries management and the biodiversity discussions are interlinked. We're from FAO's side, we're very interested that the fisheries sector is part of that debate. And believe that area-based fisheries measures could contribute not only to achieve primary objective of fisheries sustainability, but also providing strong co-benefits for biodiversity. We see this as an opportunity to reconcile food security, biodiversity conservation, and sustainable development goals and help achieve SDGs alongside with global biodiversity targets. And we obviously stand ready and willing to help our member states in the fisheries sector. And with that, I thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation, which shows inter alia that for those wishing to apply OECMs in the future, there is really plenty of good guidance available. And you've shown this very, very clearly. Thank you very much indeed. And after this intervention, we move to the last two ones of this afternoon, and those are from two Commission officials, from DG Environment, Mr. Vedran Nikolic, and from DG Mare, Mr. Kenneth Patterson. I understand that they will share a presentation, and they will speak 10 minutes each. So Vedran and Kenneth, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all participants and honorable members. And well, big thanks to the EP Intergroup for inviting us. I hope that you can hear me well and that you can see my presentation currently on the screen. I will present the latest developments in EU biodiversity policy, but focusing primarily on the commitments and targets of EU biodiversity strategy for 2030 and how OECMs could contribute to reaching those targets in the strategy, while my colleague Kenneth will focus more on the issue from the perspective of our common fisheries policy. Now, we know, when we have heard a number of times today, that while MPAs are a fundamental tool to conserve marine biodiversity, the OECMs are really widely and increasingly recognized as a very important tool to contribute to those objectives. And well, whilst we know that today we have something about 12% of our EU seas covered by MPAs, and these are mainly Natura 2000 sites designated under our nature legislation, we know that OECMs have so far not been recognized or reported across EU waters. So we don't really know much about their current contribution or what they might contribute, their potential to contribute to reaching the goals of our biodiversity policies and legislation. But what we do know is that the existing MPA networks are really not sufficiently large and coherent to safeguard marine biodiversity. And we also know that we still have a lot of so-called paper parks. So for us, the achieving of effective management of MPAs is really a priority to ensure the adequate protection and restoration of marine ecosystems, but also to deliver important socioeconomic benefits through enhancing ecosystem services. And for all these reasons, for the shortcomings and for the opportunities, the Commission has presented the EU biodiversity strategy for 2030 last year. And this is, of course, one of the main pillars of the European Green Deal. And this strategy has set an overarching goal to finalize a coherent trans-European nature network of protected areas by expanding the current areas covered by protected areas, but also this includes OECMs. Now, these targets, which were set out in 2020 and since then have been supported by member states of the EU, are quite ambitious. And we have really committed to legally protect at least 30% of European Union land and sea, and to strictly protect at least a third of this area. We also committed to effectively manage all of these areas by putting in place adequate conservation objectives and measures and to monitor them appropriately. Now, these targets work with other important commitments in the strategy. We will soon propose a new legislation with legally binding restoration targets as part of the EU Nature Restoration Plan. that aims to achieve really a number of actions on marine biodiversity, including on reduction of bycatch and reduction of the impact of fishing on seabed. So this future coherent and well-managed network of protected areas and OECMs can really greatly contribute to these restoration efforts while bringing back some substantial socioeconomic benefits to the society, including, of course, fisheries. And we still have a lot to do to achieve these targets. You can see the distance to 30% target on this picture on the left, on the right, sorry. And this means that although 30% coverage, as you can see, has been largely achieved now in the narrow coastal strip, there is still really a lot to do in the offshore area. And of course, we need to put marine protected areas and OECMs in the places where they will contribute to a truly coherent and well-connected network. And with respect to the target of 10% strict protection of EU waters, we are even further from the target. So considering this big gap, we think that OECMs, and we expect actually that OECMs will play a more prominent role in achieving these targets. Now, where we are now in this process of target setting and getting there, we are currently developing a process to facilitate the designation of new MPAs and OECMs, but we are also setting up a system to track the progress towards these targets. And we know that as both MPAs and OECMs will be designated and managed by EU member states, we actually rely on them to recognize an area as OECM in accordance with the CBD criteria and with the helpful guidance that exists, as it was mentioned today. And we are adapting our data streams to receive the necessary information so that we can assess if OECMs can be counted towards the target. And according to the draft document that we have almost agreed with member states, and this is a document on criteria and guidelines for identification and designation of additional areas, the OECMs will be counted towards this EU target if, well, they are covered by administrative acts, so they are legally protected by a national or international legal act. They do achieve long-term conservation outcomes, they have conservation objectives, and they have measures implemented, and they have effective management and monitoring in place. Now, this guidance document that I mentioned, it also describes a process to evaluate the initial pledges of member states related to protected areas and OECMs. So we will receive in the next 2 years pledges from member states on their designations of protected areas and OECMs. We will assess these pledges in the framework of regional seas, meetings with stakeholders, with scientists and with experts, with the aim to assess progress by 2024 on achieving these targets. And then, of course, we expect that we will find out how much the OECMs have really contributed. But we are expecting to receive and review all the potential OECMs coming from member states that will help achieve this target by 2030. And I'm actually grateful for today's presentations that all highlighted the importance of good guidance and how to consistently and meaningfully apply these OECM criteria so that we can make sure that we are really counting areas which truly make a contribution to the protection of marine biodiversity. And we are hoping that this work will be effectively used by EU member states. So this much about the use of OECMs in the context of biodiversity strategy. Thank you for your attention, and I think I will give the screen back to the chair to introduce my colleague Kenneth, and I will keep the presentation running. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And now I'll give the floor to Kenneth Patterson. It's difficult for me to introduce him because we have worked together for a number of years in the Commission. And Ken Patterson is a senior expert at the European Commission, Director General for Maritime Affairs and Fisheries. And he has a background in marine and fisheries science and in fisheries management. And he currently works on the development of the common fisheries policy with respect to the protection of marine habitats and sensitive species.
Thank you, Ernesto. And thank you, Vidant, for setting out the detailed environmental aspects so clearly. I'd like to take a couple of minutes to step back from the legal and administrative issues to look at the substance of what really the issues are here. And to begin, let's look back to 1620. This is a painting from Franz Snyder's and Antonis van Dyck, and it shows a fish market scene. It shows some differences with what you would find if you look at the fish markets today with respect to the species you would look at. Whereas fishing stocks in the North Atlantic are generally doing reasonably well because of reduced overfishing, there are species we are on the edge of losing, which we don't see anymore. And the first one you see highlighted here is the sturgeon, which used to be common in estuaries in Europe, but it's now locally extinct in most European estuaries, despite some efforts to rebuild. Next, please, Vedran. Then we also have large flatfish, such as halibut, have basically gone commercially extinct in the sea and nearby areas. Lampreys, you have seen just underneath the sturgeon. And then we look at the otters and the seals. Well, last time I was in the fishmongers, I didn't see any otters for sale, but certainly both these species were subject to hunting. And otters are at a very low level. Monk seals in the Mediterranean are also critically endangered. On the floor, you see the large skate, which used to be a really important part of commercial fisheries. There are several species, white skate, flapper skate, common skate, which are basically extinct in the North Sea and the Irish Sea, and they're only found now further north in marginal areas. And in the top left, hanging on the hook, you can just make out some eels. So biodiversity is not something theoretical. It affects what is caught in nets, and it affects what is on your plate and what you eat. This painting, I think, is a nice reminder for me of what we've lost in marine ecosystems. I could show you more examples. Next, please. Maybe the emblematic species, angel shark. These used to be a common food fish distributed all over European waters in the different species in the Mediterranean and the North Sea. But it's a large animal which inhabited shallow waters. Again, it's now virtually extinct in most EU waters, except a few remaining in the Celtic Sea and in the Canary Islands. Next, please. The Mediterranean. This species is something you would be very lucky to see nowadays, but 100 years ago they were quite common. It's a spiny butterfly ray, and it's one of several species which used to be common in the Mediterranean and now virtually extinct. You could count also the Maltese skate, the bull ray, the Mediterranean manta rays, many Mediterranean species. Among cetaceans, well, this Baltic Sea harbor porpoise would be one of about 500 which are left, but going back not even to the first part of the last century, there would have been some tens of thousands of these animals, which were exploited directly for food. There was historical hunting of these species. Now we have the small population which is critically endangered in the Baltic Sea and also harbor porpoise in the Black Sea and Iberian Peninsula. Balearic shearwater is another emblematic species which nests in the Western Mediterranean, but is distributed in the area of Western Mediterranean, but also flies down through the Strait of Gibraltar and up through the western waters and spreads out as far as the Celtic Sea, where it's caught in quite large numbers in longline fisheries, in incidental catches. Next, please. We used to have plenty of sharks in the Mediterranean, sand tiger sharks, white sharks, and poor beetle, now reduced to very low levels. Next, please. Not to talk just about sensitive species, but also habitats. We have some which are very critically endangered and on the verge of disappearing, such as this seagrass habitat. In the Atlantic area, this is critically endangered. And these are also important carbon sinks. I could go on and talk quite a lot more about species which are depleted and habitats like this Baltic Sea shell substrate, which are critically endangered, and we are on the edge of losing. There are many more species. I could talk about more dolphins and whales, sea pens, sponge beds, large sharks, but time is short and this is not the place to do it in detail. But in common, what these species have typically is they're large-bodied and they're widely distributed. So it's rather difficult to design small protected areas in MPAs to protect these species. Why are they threatened? It's because even at the youngest ages, the juveniles of these animals are about the same size as the adults of commercial fish, which is targeted by fishing gear. So fishing gear, which is designed to catch commercial fish like a cod or a herring, is still has a mesh size which will kill the very youngest hatchlings of these large-bodied species. And we have, of course, intensive fishing with bottom contacting gears, which changes and modifies seabed ecosystems across all of Europe. There are technical solutions to reducing these pressures, some of which have been implemented area by area, and others implemented more widely. Now, having looked at the biology, let's look back a little bit at the legislation rather than pictures of fish. The main conservation measures we have in the EU is these. First of all, we have under technical measures regulation, we have a set of areas where fishing with specified gears is prohibited in order to protect sensitive habitats. And some of these areas are quite wide, others are quite small, but there they are, and this is something which has been in legislation, as Ernesto will know, since around the year 2000, where we first started implementing systematically nature protection measures within the CFP. Then there are the MPAs under the Birds and Habitats Directive, Natura 2000, which Retan has referred to. Under Marine Strategy Framework Directive, the protection of seabed habitats is an entire chapter which requires the fixing of environmental standards and targets to be set about the proportion and the extent to which each habitat should be protected. This is an ongoing process which has been running for some time and still under discussion. Under Article 8 of the Common Fisheries Policy, it's also possible for member states to adopt measures to protect specific spawning grounds and juvenile habitats. This is not something which has been really taken up widely by member states yet. And member states also have a possibility to adopt measures on a national basis where that doesn't affect other member states. Next, please. Other measures broadly, we have a policy of reducing fishing mortality towards FMSY, which is largely on track in the Northeast Atlantic, but in the Mediterranean basin, it's clear we're quite far from that objective. Within technical measures, we have a prohibition on the catching, landing, transshipment, and marketing of sensitive species such as cetaceans and corals, sharks and endangered species, and vulnerable species. And we also have restrictions in fishing over deep water vulnerable marine ecosystems, the VME regulation, which is a systematic way to prevent fisheries from expanding beyond their existing footprint and to avoid any vulnerable habitats they might come across. Next, please. What are we going to do about this? Well, we do have a line of action. We've just presented a technical measures report which summarizes these issues with its staff working document, and the references to those two documents are annexed in the last slide of this presentation. I encourage you to have a look at those, which examines the substance and some of the remedial measures that we can implement to address these things, these issues. We will soon, in the next few days, start a targeted stakeholder consultation about measures to be taken to protect sensitive species, sensitive habitats, and to further protect commercial fish stocks. After that, the Commission is going to publish an action plan, which is going to set out measures for the Commission to take, recommendations for member states to take, and also for stakeholders. And these recommendations fall under the regionalization chapter of the Common Fisheries Policy. So the recommendations for member states to work together to assemble packages of measures to protect sensitive species, to collect data and monitor the condition of those species, and do the same for sensitive habitats. Those recommendations are then what the Commission would use to adopt regional technical measures. I haven't mentioned OECM so far in this presentation because these measures we have developed have not been developed with the OECM label or criteria in mind. But from this presentation, it's clear there are useful concepts here which can be applied to some of them, and especially the consideration of specific criteria here be a useful, say, screening mechanism to better focus minds on what is being done and why it's being done, and introduce some discipline in the process. So I think I look forward to the further developments we have in consolidating this concept. It's clear a lot of good and useful work has been done, and we look forward to following this up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Vedran and Ken. This has been keeps sort of pushing forward for conservation and good management of the oceans. Thank you very much for that. So we now can go to the debate. We have 72 participants, and we have already 4 questions coming in. So I will start by the first one. So the first question comes from Kim Friedman. Hello, Kim. Good to hear from you. And it's not addressed to anybody in particular from the panel. So any panelist who would like to answer this first question is welcome to do so. So Kim Friedman is telling us, wish to talk about the move by UCN to call OECMs conserved areas. And he has 2 problems with this. First of all, that conserved areas is past tense, when we should be talking about future measures, not about the past. And secondly, if we talk about conserved areas, this would mean or seem to suggest that areas subject to sustainable use are not conserved. So couldn't we come up with a term that is less misleading than that? Who wants to take the floor? I see Serge.
Thanks, Ernesto. It's an interesting question because the people of the World Commission on Protected Areas have in fact suggested to use this term to put together all the areas that have been created by different institutions for different reasons, but have in common the property that they meet the criteria of OECMs. And they have suggested this term, conserved areas, as a term that differentiates them from protected areas. So we would have in the ocean protected areas, and we know what they are, and we would have conserved areas, which include a very large categories of types of areas in various sectors and by various institutions. And the question is whether or not that term is acceptable or not. That has not been decided yet. There are pros and cons, I guess. My point on this is that if you just read the CBD decision, OECMs are called other effective area-based conservation measures. So it's obvious that the OECMs are conservation measures, even if there are others. And therefore, my temptation would have been to call all of these other measures conservation measures or conservation areas. And the question is whether conservation areas or conserved areas make any difference. I think one of the points that Kim made about the past tense is not so much that they look in the past instead of looking to the future, is that the name implies that the area is already protected. It's the same when you talk about protected areas, it assumes that they are protected. And we know that most protected areas are not protected. And he has the same problem with conserved areas, that we assume that they are conserved just because they are called OECM, but in reality, it's not obvious. But I would stress a difference, which is that for MPAs, you can create an area without having really the obligation to prove that it's protected. But you cannot create an OECM if you have not proven that it is conserved. So I'm open to the discussion, but I'm not sure that there is really a problem if they would be called conserved areas or conservation areas.
I understand that Imen Melian would like to answer to this question as well. Please.
I will put my hat as Vice Chair of the World Commission on Protected Areas while answering this question. And just to confirm Serge's understanding that this is not an official position of either IUCN or the WCPA. I think that there are divergences of views. I think some people may share Kim's concerns. There is a desire to, as we refer to protected areas, to find an easy way to not repeat OECMs. I'm not sure we have found the right wording or that we will find the right word. So just to stress that it's not an official position. Thanks.
Does anybody else from the panel wish to answer this first question by Kim? I don't see any hands being raised. Oh, Ken, yes. Ken, please.
Yes, thanks. I mean, conservation is good in the sense you don't make it, you at least stabilize the situation, don't make things worse, but what would be better is restoration. But when you start discussing restoration, then you have to answer difficult questions such as how far do you want to restore back towards a pristine state? How much of the area do you want to restore to a pristine state? How much can you still exploit? How much of the habitat do you want to keep as it is? And even what level of protection do you want to implement? And those questions have proven very difficult to answer. It's relatively straightforward where you have a small charismatic patch of animals such as sponges or sea pens, but where you have large expanses of seabed where certain species have been extirpated, it certainly becomes a very difficult decision.
Okay, thank you, Ken. There's nobody else in the panel that wishes to answer the first question. So shall we move to the second one? And this is a very interesting question from Jérôme Jourdain concerning the question of the boundaries. And he says that the whole idea of OECMs is defined on boundaries. But then the question is that should those boundaries be flexible to take into account, for example, the effects of highly migratory fish? And I think that Imen Melian is making a very good point that I would have made myself. I fully agree with you, Imen, that this is a very relevant point, which is that, well, due to climate change, we know that species distributions are moving. So the question is that this area-based kind of measure, should they have kind of moving boundaries or boundaries that are adaptable to the movements of the biomass of the species, some of which we want to protect? Who wants to take the floor? Yeah, I see. Yeah, go ahead.
Ellen.
Go ahead, Ellen.
Hi. Yeah, it is a very interesting question, and I think parts of it can be addressed by networks of closed areas, just as we have networks of MPAs. So the question referred to highly migratory species, so that you could identify different areas that are of importance. But what I wanted to really raise in this context is why I think here OECMs have a great advantage over the MPAs. And it comes back to this question of the permanency of the issues. So many of these OECMs are put in place using annual fishing licenses. So they can be updated and modified very regularly and be responsive to changes in species distributions. Others, such as the ones put in place for the benthic features under the vulnerable marine ecosystem kind of approach, are reviewed every 5 years. And this has been seen as a criticism, but you can also see it as an advantage in that by having this sort of built-in review of the data and information in the OCM process, which isn't necessarily there in the MPA process, this gives you that flexibility to be able to cope with a changing environment. So it is something that I think is on many people's minds, but that, to me, I think is a strength of the OECMs and might actually be brought forward in that context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ellen. I understand that Joe Appiot wanted to answer actually question 1. Sorry, Joe, that I didn't see you raising your hand. So go ahead, please.
Oh, no.
And then I see Serge asking for the floor. Joe.
Great, yeah. Thank you, Ernesto. No problem for that. I didn't want to slow the discussion down, but coming back to this issue of this terminology of conserved areas, I mean, I'm not going to make any commentary on the use of the term that terminology that's being discussed. I mean, in the CBD context, of course, we have to go from what our Conference of the Parties decides. But this does bring a point that I think was an important part of the process of working out, you know, the sort of the remit of OECMs. And one thing that's really important to remember is where OECMs come from is that is it's in the context of Target 11, which is areas are conserved through protected areas or OECMs. And in this context, it means that the OECMs are useful for addressing threats or pressures where of the sectors and those specific threats and pressures that are facing that area. So it's certainly not in the spirit of OECM to have a situation in which one sector says, "Oh, we're taking care of our measures," but if another sector, other threats are happening there, human activities are happening there that are adversely impacting the area. Likewise, that wouldn't achieve and wouldn't really live up to the OECM, the point of OECMs. I think when we're talking about sectoral measures, I mean, the expectation and the hope is that the expectation certainly is that the measures are addressing the main, if not the only, pressures that are facing that area. And that's why perhaps it's more appropriate to go through a sectoral management approach. So we certainly don't want a situation in which, one sector says we're doing our job, but the other sectors are screwing everything up, and then that's okay. It's still a fisheries OECM. No, that's certainly not what we want. So it's important in that vein to cast the OECM term in the context of where it came from, of conservation of areas. So.
Okay, thank you, Joe. I understand Serge asked for the floor to answer questions 1 or 2. Serge?
Yes. I was trying to answer the second question about the potential mobility. And it's a very good question for various reasons, but just to be short, I mean, obviously the ocean environment is a lot more mobile and dynamic than the terrestrial environment. And one poor side sad side of conservation is that it has been very often strongly terrestrial in its origin and then extended to the ocean. The problem is, of course, that the ocean is a lot more mobile, flexible, variable than land. And so we might have, when we go from land to the ocean, to think about something a bit more dynamic and adaptable. Climate change has just made that question even more serious. I mean, we know that some of the fish have moved 2,500 kilometers already. So having an MPA to protect them before is probably of no use now, and you may have to adjust that. But I don't think that anyone is against that in principle. But it raises a few interesting questions. I mean, for instance, Hélène was showing later the example of the haddock box. And the haddock box is in a particular place, and it is under a set of jurisdictions. And there are discussions to figure out whether or not that area is still useful for the haddock. And there are suggestions that it should be moved. And so the question becomes, okay, that area contains seamounts. Now, if it was declared as an OECM and suddenly the haddock moves away, then the fisheries have to move the protected area to continue to protect the haddock. In that case, what happens to the seamounts that were there before? The biodiversity attributes will still be there. They would still need protection. They may even need more protection now that the fishing area has moved north. So what will happen in that case? It's a very interesting debate. And of course, states will have to decide case by case what they do in each case. For instance, they might move the fishing part of the area, but keep the biodiversity part of the area with another name or even the same name, but primarily dealing only with conservation. It's not a semantic issue. It's a very, very interesting issue.
Thank you. Then shall we move to the third question from the floor? And this comes from Seamus Bonner. Is co-management with fishers and coastal communities being considered as part of OECM management? I think that at least 2 of the panelists, Imen Melian and Ellen Kensington, have already provided sort of answers in the question and answer. Would you like to present your answers in orally to this question? Any of you two? Yes, Ellen.
Yes, I just cut and paste one of the criteria that is in the CBD 14.8 decision, and it involves the governance and management and upholding of locally relevant cultural, spiritual values, etc. So I would think that this can be demonstrated very clearly when you have a co-management situation. And of course, there's nothing that would oppose such an arrangement, to my knowledge.
Okay.
And just to complement that when the language of the criteria was discussed in the workshop leading to their adoption, I recall that there was some discussion as to the wording that's used in the table for criterion B3, which is managed, and it talks about management system, specifically because, for protected areas, we talk about having a management plan. And that was intentional to actually recognize that some areas that could be managed by indigenous people or local communities may not have a proper plan and an authority, but do have an informal system that enables for that effective management to happen. And so it's the short answer to the question is yes. Thanks.
Okay, Imen, thank you very much. And we move, the questions are popping up. This is very interesting. So the participants are very active, which only shows the interest of the presentations by the panelists. And next question is from Sasha Clemison. And that is another extremely interesting question. Would you think that OECMs are better targeted at well-used areas rather than pristine areas? And so can you see any risk of using OECMs for pristine areas? Who wants to take the floor on this one?
Ellen.
Ellen?
Yeah, sorry. I can just give you that example of the seamount areas in NAFO that the workshop looked at, because this is a case where areas that are not currently fished and have never been fished, whether they're pristine, I guess is another question. But they certainly have been considered, and I think that it's appropriate to do so because even though there's no current threat to by the fishing, by identifying such areas and using fisheries measures to protect them, they kind of defer the potential for future threats to occur, at least from the fisheries sector. So I think it's still very valuable to use such measures to identify such areas, such as you described. Thanks.
Thank you, Ellen. Any other intervention on this question? Yes, I see Joe.
Sure.
Joe, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. A very interesting question. I think something that many of us have wrestled with as well. And unfortunately, I think the answer, like many of our answers on these issues, is it depends. It very much depends on the situation that you're dealing with. So indeed, we can imagine many scenarios in which OECMs can be, especially when we're talking about sectoral OECMs, many scenarios in which areas are subjected to either one or a small number of uses. And in those cases, OECMs in those individual sectors can be, let's say, perhaps more efficiently developed and implemented and perhaps more effectively managed. But if we have areas that are heavily used by a wide range of activities and facing a number of different human pressures, as I said before, only addressing one of those pressures and one of those sectors is not sufficient to achieve the overarching goal of what we're trying to do. So in that vein, is it easier or better to have multiple, let's say, OECMs in all of these different sectors, or something closer and akin to an overarching, more highly protected area? Of course, it also depends on what the features there are, what your objectives are for that area, how much protection is needed. So it really, they can be easier and more appropriate for used areas, but it depends on what the features there, what features are there, how much protection they need, what kind of pressures they're facing, and how much management is actually needed. And likewise for OECMs in pristine areas, as we heard the really useful example from Ellen. I mean, if there's an area that hasn't faced use but has a possibility to face a use from a certain sector or a specific sector or a small number of sectors, it could make a lot of sense to have those preemptive measures in place for those areas to make sure they stay pristine. So yeah, it depends. It really depends on the features there, the pressures, and what you're trying to do with the area, what the objectives are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. And I see Ken wishing to take the floor. Ken, please.
Thanks. Yes. Well, let's assume you want to protect an ecosystem which is a sensitive habitat. Often, what does it mean, a sensitive habitat? Usually it means you have something which is slow growing and takes a long time to recover from fishing. Now, species which are slow growing, obviously they have a long lifespan. So even a light amount of fishing pressure, say fishing once every 5 years or so, is enough to create a big impact and destroy such an ecosystem. So in terms of costs and benefits, if you simply reduce the fishing on the lightly fished area, then you have big opportunity to rebuild a pristine ecosystem with a relatively low cost. If you are trying to cover an ecosystem which is heavily fished, then obviously there will be a big loss in fishing and a huge cost. And the counterpart to that, the benefit you get from it, is going to be uncertain. It may be high, you may have evidence that there will be a very valuable ecosystem you want to recover, but the cost benefit is tilted a bit in a different direction. So the first priority generally is to reduce fishing on lightly fished areas, which has a low cost and a big chance of promoting recovery, at least for the purpose of protecting long-lived species.
Okay, thanks very much, Ken. Any other panelists wishes to intervene on this one? I see Serge. Serge, please.
Just a small point, because there's been some concern expressed in the conservation arena about that question. If we are talking about a pristine habitat, that means that it has not been touched by fishing, which means that it is in reality out of the usual footprint of the fishery. And people have already sent a warning that it is not possible for the fisheries people to create OECMs away from the fishing ground just to get the 30% coverage on areas to which nothing is happening, in the sense that natural habitats that would remain natural, even if you don't do anything, cannot be listed as fishery OECMs if you want. And so we have just to remember, and the example that Hélène gave is right, is that you can probably create OECMs in fisheries as long as you are committed to protect that area. So you define it geographically, you protect it, you enforce it. In that case, it can be a fisheries OECM because it is established and enforced by fisheries. But you need that condition that that pristine area is, otherwise it is an OECM of the state, and the state can do whatever it wants to protect it, but it's not anymore related to the fishery sector.
Okay, thank you, Serge. Any other question on this point? If not, we move to the next question, which is from Afef Butoba and concerns the Mediterranean challenges. So how are we going to face the Mediterranean challenges through OECMs, inter alia? Who wants to take the floor on this one?
I guess it should be Imen, yes?
Yeah. Well, yes, Imen has asked for the floor, so Imen, please go ahead.
I will try to attempt. I guess one of the main challenges that we're seeing is some of the data in some Mediterranean countries to particularly justify, or to document the effectiveness of the areas, and particularly for some southern and eastern Mediterranean countries where fisheries data is sparse and we are in data poor environment, that is a bit of a challenge. The other thing is not many Mediterranean, and again, there is a difference in which Mediterranean countries we're talking about, is that there's not that much use of a diversity of area-based fisheries management measures in southern and eastern Mediterranean in particular, and so you know, we don't have many examples. But the biggest challenge that we are facing is the data, and in many of the areas don't necessarily have monitoring plans, and we don't have the series of data. That doesn't mean that for an OECM to be recognized, you need a huge amount of data, but sometimes some of the basic data is actually missing or is not recorded. And I'm sure Serge would complement that.
Yes, I would.
Want to chip in on this one?
If you have time. No.
Yes, go ahead.
One general point, which is not only for the Mediterranean, it's for a lot of areas in the world which are not well managed in terms of fisheries management, or not managed at all, which is the case for many small-scale fisheries. My point is, if you have a system in which governance is weak and the management is not working, OECMs will never work. Never. But the fact is that a lot of those fisheries are simply poorly managed by the state, which gives to those fisheries too little attention. And so something that has never been said, perhaps, is that OECMs are an opportunity for the fishery sector to increase co-management and community-based management. And in that case, OECMs probably have a good chance to be developed effectively and not just as paper parks.
All right. Okay. I think we have two additional questions by Afef Butoba on the Mediterranean. I guess it's probably again for Imen Melian to answer them. One of them concerns how could FAO contribute in enhancing the capacity building of the member states of the Mediterranean, and which synergies can be reached between the EU biodiversity strategy by 2030 and the regional frameworks related to this issue in the Mediterranean region. Who wants to, and the first one, I guess, is for Imen. The second one, I wonder whether somebody from the Commission can answer this, please.
Well, I'll start with a quick answer of the second one, because the EU biodiversity strategy was taken into consideration as a basis when we developed the regional post-2020 target, post-2020 strategy on MPAs and OECMs under the Barcelona Convention for the Mediterranean. So we've looked at what are the evolving strategy, and so that there is some harmony between the strategies. How FAO is working in the Mediterranean is in close collaboration also with the FAO offices, the regional office, and the General Fisheries Commission for the Mediterranean, so that we build upon some of particularly the capacity building activities that have been happening there, and be complementary in what's happening in the region. So as I have mentioned, it is a collaborative effort in the Mediterranean, as we really need to consider the context of the countries, and that there is an engagement also with the fishing authorities. And so there is a lot of listening at the moment as to what is the need of the countries. What do they really need? What kind of information, what kind of support, and what kind of capacity? And we're still in that listening phase before we kind of jump in and say, well, here's what you have to do. We really are very interested in hearing from the countries. And so this is an open invitation to all of you here to tell us about what do you think the priorities and guidance should be, and in the efforts of FAO should be. So hopefully that helps answer the question. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Imen. And do the colleagues from the Commission wish to answer the second question?
Sorry, I think
the biodiversity strategy and the Mediterranean initiatives.
I may just say a few quick words, minding the time. I think Imen covered it very well. This is the EU biodiversity strategy, meaning that it's a commitment of EU member states, but it's also our contribution to the global efforts, including then it's our contribution that we will bring to the Mediterranean, and we are interested to talk with our partners, not just, I think the question was about the Union for Mediterranean, which is intergovernmental body, but also with the Barcelona Convention and other players in the Mediterranean to make sure that we do these efforts together. So this is our contribution, which we are happy to discuss and implement finally, hopefully, together in the framework of the Mediterranean cooperation. And there are many other initiatives by France, by Greece, by many countries asking for the Mediterranean to do more, because it can do more, and it certainly is a sea which will benefit from additional protection, be it to help fight overfishing or to conserve really important and unique habitats there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we are approaching the time to close this. Let me first of all thank the panelists for the very interesting presentations. I think you have kept them short and relevant. I really congratulate you all for extremely efficient ways of making your points. Let me also thank the participants, now 60 left, but there were as many as 75 at some stage. I think we had very many interesting questions, to the point that I would have liked to ask 2 questions myself to the panelists, but I, of course, gave priority to the questions coming from the floor. So at the end, I didn't have a chance to ask my questions, but never mind. I think the important is that the participants really feel engaged in this debate. I think I've learned many things. It is important, and let me kind of summarize as a takeaway kind of messages that, of course, as Joe reminded us, this is not just about conservation, it's also about sustainable use. I think this is very important. We have also learned that there is plenty of case studies and plenty of guidance on how to do OECMs. This is extremely important, because at any rate, when we discuss in the future what role is to be played by OECMs in implementing the biodiversity objectives of the Union, we have to know that there is guidance and there is specific case studies that show us the way in which we can actually treat and meaningfully use OECMs as a possible instrument. I think we have had interesting discussions about whether they can apply to pristine situations or not. I also retain that although there's plenty of experience in the use of OECMs as a legislative instrument, this is not very common in the European Union. So this is an interesting area for discussion. Does the EU consider that this is an instrument worth exploring further? Because I think that if I can summarize, I think we all agree that when we start thinking about how to implement in practice the 30 by 30 objective, we all wish it to be a success, but at the same time, we also wish the fishing activity to continue. We also wish the objectives of the common fishery policy to be achieved. So we have a lot to discuss in the coming months and year as to how to make compatible the 2 objectives. What is the way of ensuring that we can go to the 30 by 30 biodiversity objective, while at the same time enhancing more than blocking fishing activity and healthy fisheries management. I think this is the kind of square circle that many people might think is impossible, but we have to believe that it is possible. I think that will be the big issue to discuss in the coming years. I believe this is possible, but we all have a common responsibility to find the ways of making this work together. So that's my main takeaway message. I wish to thank you all again. I presume this will not be the last time we certainly from EBCD, we try to promote debates on this issue. And thank you very much again. Have a good evening. I give the floor back to Ilias Grampas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ernesto, for moderating today's discussion in such an interactive and stimulating manner, as well as for presenting the event's key takeaway messages so very much to the point. I would also like to take the opportunity on behalf of the Secretariat of the European Parliament Intergroup to thank hosting MEP, Mr. Pierre Karleskind, for joining us today, and of course to our excellent set of speakers and dear viewers for their active engagement, as highlighted by Ernesto with regards to addressing how we can advance progress towards the European Green Deal and specifically OECMs implementation in the fisheries sector. So as we are wrapping up today's online event on behalf of the Secretariat of the European Parliament Intergroup, I'm very much looking forward equally to continuing the debate in the future. So until then, stay safe, all the best, and see you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.